I carried myself through the system for years, believing this city had a place for me. I worked my shifts, I clocked my hours, and I watched the wealth around me rise into clouds. But in this market, you don't fall down slowly, you get cut out overnight. One missed check because of a brief illness, one corporate rent hike on a modest studio, and suddenly the deadbolt is changed. They tell you to move along. They sweep your tent off the dirt, but they never answer the baseline mathematical question. Where does a minimum wage worker actually go when the entire grid has been priced out of human survival? Welcome to Homeless U.S. News. At first glance, Seattle, Washington, presents itself as a metropolis of absolute promise. It is an urban landscape where the future feels immediately real, where technology constantly evolves, and where generational opportunity seems available to anyone with enough ambition to pursue it. Majestic high-rises wrapped in gleaming glass walls pierce the gray sky. Crowds move through the commercial core at a brisk, determined pace, carrying massive corporate goals and digital dreams. Monolithic enterprises like Amazon continuously expand their physical and economic footprint across the city, while Microsoft remains a symbol of entrenched global power. On the surface, the machine of the Emerald City appears to be functioning perfectly, but strip away the progressive marketing, look past the corporate plazas, and the structural reality begins to bleed through. The balance of the city has been completely lost. Beneath the rapid tech growth, a crushing economic pressure has been building quietly but systematically. Rental prices that were once manageable for the working class have hyperinflated into an absolute wall of exclusion. Modest neighborhoods have been transformed into luxury asset classes. For some, these rising costs are merely baseline adjustments on a spreadsheet. But for thousands of others, it is a final breaking point. Today, we are bypassing the tourist brochures to look directly at the real story of human displacement in Seattle. If you believe that human lives should never be treated as invisible collateral damage, smash that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications. Let's walk these blocks together. Drop a comment below right now. How does it feel to see extreme destitution existing just blocks away from the wealthiest corporations on Earth? Let's uncover the truth. Part 1. The Metropolitan Fault Line, the numbers of purging. The humanitarian crisis on the streets of Seattle did not emerge by accident. It is not the sudden result of an isolated macroeconomic incident or a collective failure of personal character. Rather, it is a calculated mathematical outcome of multiple structural factors slowly converging to form a permanent emergency. To truly map this displacement, we must look past the political theater and analyze the real ledger of poverty. The primary catalyst driving families and workers onto the pavement is the absolute weaponization of the real estate market. In this metropolis, basic physical shelter is no longer treated as a human necessity. It has been transformed into a speculative commodity. High-density construction continues across every block, and new luxury towers alter the skyline daily. However, this massive infrastructure development is intentionally not intended for everyone. These units command astronomical price points aimed exclusively at those with tech-driven capital. Meanwhile, housing options for low-income residents are systematically dismantled, replaced by commercial projects that yield higher corporate profit margins. This structural gap has created a pronounced state of economic inequality, where two separate realities coexist on the exact same blocks but rarely intersect. On one side are the professionals functioning in the technology sector with high, stable incomes and expanding investment portfolios. On the other side are the essential laborers, service workers, and retail staff earning ordinary wages, while drowning beneath the skyrocketing cost of baseline survival. The chasm between these groups is widening into a vast canyon. For those at the bottom of the ladder, every single price increase feels like an added weight on their chest. When an economy becomes this exclusive, a full-time employee can work 40 hours a week and still find themselves unable to afford a safe place to sleep. Savings slowly erode, choices disappear, and a working citizen lands directly on the concrete. 2. The clinical meat grinder, behavioral health and survival mode. The crisis in Seattle is not merely an economic housing problem. It carries a devastating behavioral health emergency that unfolds in slow motion across our public sidewalks. A massive percentage of those forced to survive on the streets are managing deep, unhealed psychological wounds, severe mental health conditions, multi-generational trauma, and acute chemical dependencies. The street environment acts as a clinical meat grinder for the human nervous system, transforming pre-existing vulnerabilities into permanent states of mental paralysis. Imagine attempting to maintain your psychiatric stability when your body is kept in a continuous state of emergency hypervigilance for months or years. The constant threat of physical violence, the absolute lack of secure rest, and the public humiliation of being treated like an eyesore wear down the mind's natural coping mechanisms. The severe anxiety attacks, the deep clinical depression, and the cognitive dislocations witnessed at major commercial intersections are the direct biological results of a mind trying to survive an unendurable environment without a bedroom door to close. This behavioral health emergency is made infinitely worse by a complete lack of an integrated medical safety net on the pavement. The existing support system is structurally incapable of reaching those in acute distress. Social programs exist on paper, and emergency shelter spaces are provided, but the sheer velocity of human need far exceeds the available capacity. If an unhoused citizen wants to seek psychiatric help, they face waiting lists that stretch for months. If they manage to secure prescriptions, keeping them safe in a nylon tent during a Pacific Northwest winter storm is an everyday struggle. Backpacks are stolen and medications quickly degrade. The lack of low-barrier, integrated housing paired with intensive counseling means that thousands are left to manage their inner storms completely alone, trapping them inside a cycle of mental decline that grows heavier with every single sunrise. Part 3. The Parallel World. The biology of the concrete night. As darkness falls over the Seattle grid, and the coastal air grows colder by the moment, the parallel reality that is hidden during the day slowly emerges into full public view under the dim streetlights, between cracks of multi-million-dollar tech offices, and in the commercial corners that are rarely noticed by the daytime crowds. Thousands of our neighbors are preparing for a night of extreme vulnerability. On the hard concrete, a discarded piece of wet cardboard serves as their only mattress. Beneath highway overpasses, the deafening roar of passing luxury vehicles becomes the constant backdrop to an endless night. Inside fragile nylon tents, people desperately try to construct a small shred of personal security, even though the street is an environment that is never truly safe. This is life on the asphalt, without a deadbolt to turn, without physical comfort, and without any mathematical certainty about tomorrow. Every single sunrise begins with the exact same primal biological questions. Where can I locate a drop of clean water today? Where can I find a facility to wash my skin without being chased out by private security? Where can I sit for an hour without being threatened with arrest for trespassing? As the night grows deeper, the environmental challenges turn into life-threatening emergencies. The damp, penetrating northwest air pierces through clothing, rain falls without warning, and a permanent layer of situational anxiety takes over the nervous system. People live with the constant fear of being assaulted, the fear of losing their identification documents to a sudden storm, or the simple fear of not waking up the next day. Some survivors attempt to preserve their dignity inside cramped, unpowered vehicles, turning old cars into temporary shelters. Others are forced into constant physical movement from one alleyway to another to avoid municipal enforcement crews. Moving is not a solution. It is an exhausting, soul-draining holding action that merely delays physical collapse for one more day, slowly erasing a person's identity and hope. Part 4. The revolving door, the management of optics. Despite the visible acceleration of human suffering across the city core, Seattle has not stood still. Massive amount of public funding have been directed toward mitigation strategies, and numerous housing policies have been tested by municipal administrators. However, the more resources a city throws at short-term answers, the clearer it becomes that temporary containment measures are a structural failure. Emergency shelters are operating at maximum capacity, yet the sidewalks continue to fill with tents because real, permanent pathways out of destitution do not exist. One of the most heavily debated approaches is the housing first model, an evidence-based concept that prioritizes immediate physical safety by providing an unhoused person with a permanent home first, without forcing them to clear arbitrary behavioral milestones or prove prior sobriety. For some individuals, this model has served as a life-saving anchor, allowing their nervous systems to leave survival mode so they can begin the long, difficult work of rehabilitation. But because the supply of supportive units remains a drop in the bucket compared to the ocean of human need, thousands are left to languish on stagnant waiting lists for years. The policy that sparks the most intense social controversy is the aggressive enforcement of encampment clearings. Encampment cleanup crews periodically move through high-visibility zones to dismantle tents and move people along. During these sweeps, the material belongings of unhoused residents, their changes of clothing, blankets, life-saving medications, and legal identity documents are systematically lost or destroyed by heavy machinery. Some housed residents and business operators deem these operations absolutely necessary to restore public cleanliness and property security. But for the person inside the tent, a sweep is a traumatizing reset. Displacing a person from one block to another does nothing to cure poverty. It simply forces a highly vulnerable population to scatter into more hidden, dangerous corners of the city, proving that managing the optics of public spaces does nothing but deepen the trauma. Part 5. The Civic Rift, Social Friction Across the Frontier. As the unsheltered population grows in visibility and density, it creates powerful waves of social friction that ripple through every layer of Seattle's shared civic spaces. The consequences are no longer confined to specific districts. They have altered the daily rhythm of residential neighborhoods and commercial zones alike. Small independent merchants find themselves forced to invest heavily in private security contractors, shorten their operational hours, and maintain a constant state of vigilance just to keep their businesses viable in an increasingly unpredictable environment. For the unhoused population, this visibility is a source of permanent anxiety and public humiliation. They carry the immense psychological weight of being treated like a public safety risk, a public nuisance, or an economic hazard by the very community they use to build. They face a shrinking map of survival. Places to rest are systematically eliminated, and opportunities for basic acceptance are incredibly rare. They are forced to endure not only the physical harshness of outdoor exposure, but also the constant rejection of those around them. These two separate realities exist side by side on the exact same asphalt, yet they rarely truly understand each other. One world feels disturbed and economically compromised, while the other world feels entirely excluded from humanity. This tension creates a quiet, emotional distance between citizens. Public discussions become highly sensitive, political opinions turn intensely polarized, and collective empathy begins to rapidly wane. Over time, the structural lines become more visible, not just between those who possess a home and those who sleep in the dirt, but between those who still hold on to compassion and those who are growing weary of the crisis. This friction isn't always displayed in open conflict. It is there in the quiet turns of daily conversation, the averted glances of commuters stepping over bodies, and the small administrative decisions that are defining the face of the metropolis. When a humanitarian emergency is treated as a permanent feature of the urban terrain, the shared cohesion of the entire city begins to fracture from within. Part 6. The Underground Cohesion. The spark of grassroots lives. In the middle of the systemic shortage and slow-moving government response, the survival of thousands of human beings on Seattle's wet pavement depends entirely on a highly sophisticated network of grassroots organizations, mutual aid teams, and independent volunteers. This is the underground cohesion of the city, a quiet, unyielding movement of ordinary citizens who refuse to accept human degradation as an unalterable condition of their neighborhoods. These grassroots teams work without corporate boards or political focus groups. They spend their hours walking from tent to tent in the freezing coastal rain, bringing hot meals, clean drinking water, fresh dry socks, and wound care kits directly to the pavement. These are simple material items. But for a person who has spent months feeling completely invisible to the world around them, an outreach worker who remembers their name and listens to their history, without judgment, represents a life-saving anchor. Frontline nonprofits continue to operate despite severe budget limitations and bureaucratic gridlock. They provide baseline healthcare clinics, assist individuals with the complex digital paperwork required to replace lost state identification, and try to reconnect marginalized citizens with a stable path back toward society. The process is far from fast or easy, but it is ongoing. When housing programs are paired directly with these intensive support networks, real human transformations take place. Individuals step off the concrete, enter their own apartments, and begin to build stable daily routines. Everyone carries a different story, separate psychological wounds, and distinct challenges that cannot be solved by a one-size-fits-all program. But behind all these limitations, the human effort never truly stops. Not because the systemic outcome is guaranteed, but because giving up on a neighbor is not a moral option. Part 7. The crushing logistics of survival, the tax of poverty. It is incredibly expensive and logistically brutal to be absolutely broke on the streets of Seattle. The general public often operates under the false assumption that survival outdoors is free, but the economic math of the pavement tells a completely different story. When you do not possess a refrigerator, a stove, a mailbox, or a door with a key, the basic cost of keeping your physical form alive completely skyhits. Every single logistical necessity becomes a high-cost daily transaction. Without a kitchen, you cannot purchase cheap bulk groceries. You're forced to buy expensive, single-serving prepared foods from convenience stores, consuming your micro-budget within days. Without a washing machine, keeping your clothes clean enough to pass a job interview requires spending your last remaining dollars at commercial laundromats. If you manage to secure important legal documents or a cell phone to stay in touch with housing navigators, you must pay for a private storage locker or risk having them stolen while you sleep in the open air. The constant physical movement required to avoid trespassing charges means that footwear destroys itself within months, forcing you to walk on raw, blistered feet. This is the crushing math of the sidewalk, a predatory cycle where the simple state of lacking an address extracts a massive financial and physical tax on human survival, making exit from the loop nearly impossible without intervention. Part 8. The shifting targets, the senior and youth vision. We must also look closely at the demographic shift that is quietly changing the face of poverty across the Pacific Northwest. Homelessness is no longer confined to the stereotypical images of the past. The fastest growing group entering the survival loop in King County consists of senior citizens over the age of 65. These are individuals who worked for decades in agriculture, retail, or manual labor, surviving on modest wages, while believing that their Social Security would protect them in their twilight years. But when a basic apartment costs more than their entire monthly check, the math collapses. We see grandmothers trying to navigate the rocky terrain of desert washes with walkers, trying to find a shaded spot where they won't be seen. At the opposite end of this tragedy is the rise of unaccompanied youth, teenagers who have fled foster care systems or broken homes, landing directly on the streets of Midtown. They gather near skate parks and vacant lots, creating makeshift families to look out for one another. By failing to protect these two extreme pillars of our community, our oldest and our youngest, we are witnessing a systemic tearing of the social contract. It is a slow-motion disaster that will shape the civic reality of Seattle for the next generation if immediate, targeted intervention is not deployed. The streets are consuming the history of our elders and the future of our youth simultaneously, leaving an entire city to grapple with the moral cost of its own indifference. Part 9. The Pathway Forward. Rejecting the Revolving Door. The path forward for Seattle requires a complete rejection of the idea that poverty can be policed out of sight. You cannot sweep a human being into non-existence. Real structural change only happens when a community commits to permanent, dignified housing built at the absolute scale of the emergency. This means zoning changes to allow more high-density affordable structures, a massive expansion of mobile mental health teams that operate 24 hours a day, and a framework that protects tenants from predatory evictions. The progress made by local nonprofits and the introduction of climate-resilient tiny homes show that the community possesses the intelligence and the tools to cure this crisis. What is missing is a collective political will to prioritize human shelter over speculative profit. A successful Seattle is not a city with the highest luxury high-rises. It is a community where the most vulnerable citizen can sleep through the cold night without wondering if they will survive until morning. True progress cannot be measured by how well we clear the sidewalks, but by how securely we construct the floor beneath the feet of those who have fallen. Part 10. The true measure of a metropolis, reality versus optics. Ultimately, Seattle is far more than just rows of tall commercial buildings, booming tech sectors, and big names known worldwide. This city is fundamentally about choices. It is about choosing what we collectively pay attention to and what we deliberately choose to put aside out of sight. On one hand stands the facade of a well-organized, clean, modern city full of progress, a picture of a promising digital future. But on the other hand stands a human reality that does not fit into that marketing picture. Tents lining the side of the road, people walking aimlessly through the rain, and human lives unyielding in absolute uncertainty. All of this is entirely real, yet it is rarely openly acknowledged by the institutions of power. It is always easier to focus on beautiful developments than to face uncomfortable structural truths. It is always easier to talk about macroeconomic growth than to admit that the working class is being actively chewed up and spit out by that very same growth. It is at this exact point that a city's moral direction begins to be determined, not just through technical housing policies, but through our daily attitudes, our cultural perspectives, and the small decisions we make every single day. Are those left behind still considered part of our shared human story? Or are they merely shadows to be systematically pushed out of sight to preserve property values? This question applies far beyond the boundaries of Seattle. It applies to every major metropolis across North America, and ultimately, it applies to each of us. A city's true worth cannot be measured solely by the height of its luxury buildings or the sheer size of its economy. Rather, it must be measured by who remains visible, protected, and valued, and who is allowed to fade away into the cold rain without ever being truly noticed. Outro, the voices in the drizzle. As the evening fog rolls off the Pacific Ocean, settling over the historic steeples and the wet sidewalk encampments of Seattle, our long journey through this crisis comes to a close. The neon signs of the luxury commercial districts flicker on, casting long shadows over the pavement, where thousands of our neighbors are preparing to face another freezing night exposed to the elements. What remains written in the rain of the city is a profound portrait of human endurance, sharing the exact same frame as systemic breakdown. The thousands of human hearts sleeping outside in Seattle tonight are a living mirror held up to our entire society, asking us what level of human misery we are willing to tolerate in a nation of immense abundance. They remind us that our shared stability is far more fragile than we care to admit, and that any life can be completely altered if the safety net snaps at the wrong time. They aren't asking for passive pity or empty political promises. They are dreaming of the simplest, most fundamental human dights: a quiet bed lifted off the hard ground, a front door with a key that turns, and the peace of knowing they belong somewhere safe. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for staying with us until the very final second of this extensive, continuous documentary on homeless U.S. news. In a digital world designed around rapid distraction, your decision to sit with this heavy Unfiltered truth from the first sentence to the last word carries real human weight. You are no longer just a passive viewer. You are a witness to the reality of your neighbors. If this journey through the paradox of Seattle has touched your heart, challenged your assumptions, or made you look at the streets of your own city with a little more kindness, please take a brief moment right now to smash that like button. It takes less than a second, but it tells the algorithm that deep, human-centered journalism matters, helping this message reach thousands of more minds who need to awaken to this truth. If you want to continue walking alongside us through the hidden corners of America and giving a powerful voice to those who have been silenced in the shadows, hit subscribe to Homeless U.S. News and turn on that notification bell. We are building a global community that refuses to look away from human suffering. We want to hear your voice. What part of this documentary hit you the hardest? Have you noticed this housing crisis shifting in your own hometown? Let's start an honest, deeply respectful conversation in the comment section below. We read every single thought you share. Let's keep our empathy alive, reject indifference, and remember that we're all much closer to each other than the world wants us to believe. Stay warm, stay safe, and we will see you in the next story on Homeless U.S. News.